Well, good evening. Welcome to Kopernik Observatory. My name is Drew Desker. I'm the director here at Kopernik. It's great to have you here with us for this evening's program. Also want to welcome those watching on the live stream. And for those watching on the live stream, if you put in the chat where you're coming from, we sort of like to know where people are currently residing. So let us know, and we'll share that with the crowd here. By show of hands, who is here either for the first time or hasn't been here since their fourth grade field trip? All right, a good portion. All right, who here are members? Anybody? A couple of people? All right, great. So the people that raise their hands second, members are have a special superpower, I call it, and that's what a Kopernik membership offers. We belong to what's called the Association of Science and Technology Centers, and a Kopernik membership gets you into 350 other science centers for free. So if you like this kind of place, getting a family membership can be valuable. Also, for family memberships, if you've got children, you actually get a discount on summer camps and things along those lines. So anyway, we are actually approaching our 50th anniversary. Next year, we will have been open for 50 years, and we've had a number of events planned for next year, special events. We've even arranged for a solar eclipse to happen next year, so make sure you plug into that. We're having a big gala back in October of next year, and there'll be more information about that coming down the road. So. Again, we are a public observatory, but we are an informal STEM education facility. So we do outreach to schools. We have a pretty extensive summer camp. I know we have at least two summer camp, at least three summer camp alumni here, and but also we do other programs like this evening. Earlier today we had a program called Girl Power, and it was specifically aimed at girls between 3rd and 8th grade. Today's Girl Powers was focused on engineering, different types of engineering, electrical engineering, marine engineering, some aeronautical engineering. And we always have a subject matter expert do a video conference with them, talking about the work that she does as an engineer or scientist. So today's engineer was from the Space Telescope Science Institute down in Baltimore. But a few years ago, we had an astrophysicist talking about the work that she does at NASA, using satellites to look at carbon dioxide levels and how that affects global warming. And then at the end of her session, our girls get to ask her questions. And one of the girls asked, "How did you get interested into astrophysics?" And her answer was, "Well, when I was in college, I was an English major, but my boyfriend was a physics major. And we'd go from observatory to observatory. I eventually dumped the boyfriend, but I kept the astronomy." And now she has her PhD in astrophysics and works for the Goddard Space Flight Center for NASA. So you never know where a seed's going to get planted, and that's really sort of what Kopernik's all about. And our Friday night programs are really an opportunity to really promote lifelong learning. Again, we do have some youth here in the audience, but predominantly the audience that comes here on Friday nights and watches on our live stream tend to be audience and want to be lifelong learners and just want to know how things work. Again, not everything we do is talking about space, and tonight's program is an example of that. So Dr. Stanley Hunter comes here often with his son. And he said, "Well, look, this is my area of expertise, and this might have some interest for people." So I took him up on it, and it's great to have you with us this evening. So we'll let you take it from here.
Testing. Oh, too much. All right. So I'm Dr. Stanley Hunter. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, but while I do that, if you're bored, just ask yourself this question: what actually is a concussion? And I think the word actually is actually important in this one because everyone has a knee-jerk response to that question where they say what a concussion is. But try to go deeper than that and explain it in a somewhat meaningful way. So I'm a physician at UHS Sports Medicine and Orthopedics in Vestal, a team physician for the Binghamton University Bearcats, a bunch of other schools, a bunch of other teams. I'm the director of the fellowship where we train physicians who want to go into this specialty, and also director of the UHS Concussion Center. And I do a little bit of concussion research, and a couple of you folks I work with are here today. I kind of like seeing concussions, and they grew on me over time. And one of the reasons I like seeing concussions is that it can make a pretty big difference for people. It can be pretty disruptive to one's life to have a concussion. It's also a very interesting topic with a lot of research that's ongoing. The field changes every few years. It's very deep. It's difficult to tease out what the brain is doing when it's working well, let alone when it's injured. So for those two reasons, it's pretty exciting. As far as helping patients, of course, just providing good evidence-based medicine and treatments, interventions, advice is helpful. But I find what is also very helpful and is not written about that much, some patients, is just to explain to them what is a concussion. Because a lot of people don't know, or they have a very superficial idea, or they have a misconception. And if they really understand what's going on, sometimes that's validating for the experience that they're going through. So, that being said, does anyone want to share a thought about what a concussion actually is? There's like 1 million viewers now, right? Yeah. I can tell you the most common thing that people say, there's a couple of common answers. The most common one, though, is that the brain slams into the skull. The second most common is that there's a bruise on the brain. Those aren't necessarily different. I mean, slamming into the skull could cause the bruise. Some people say both. The third most common is the brain swells up or gets inflamed. And I guess it's easier for me to do this because no one volunteered their answer, but those are all wrong. I think they're pretty matter-of-factly wrong, but I don't necessarily blame people for thinking that. So what is a concussion? You really only need two things. It's pretty simple as far as the diagnostic criteria. There are two ways I like to answer that question. One is, what meets criteria to say this is a concussion that we're looking at, this individual has been concussed? You need to have a sudden acceleration and deceleration of the head. Usually something impacts the head. And then you need a new onset of symptoms, a change from the previous status that is reasonably associated with that hit to the head. And the most common things are headache, dizziness, mood changes, light, sound sensitivity, difficulty concentrating, remembering. There's a whole long list. And you don't need all of them. If you have any of those that are new in onset after hitting your head, it's probably a concussion. But the more interesting way to answer that question is what actually happens inside of your head to cause a concussion, what actually is going on. And in real brief, it's sort of complicated. But I'll tell you what I tell the patients usually, which is the brain jiggles. The brain is sort of gelatinous. It's like Jell-O. Or it's like spongy. It's between a sponge and Jell-O. It's a little mushy. It's not mechanically strong. And so with a really hard acceleration, it can get jiggling. And that can cause microscopic tears. And those tears are too small to see on a CAT scan or an MRI. But they do tear some neurons, especially axons, which is the long projections from neurons that are susceptible to being torn. It's a small fraction of the neurons that are torn. They're not torn very far. They're microscopic tears, but the brain does so many things that disrupting the brain in a haphazard way, as of course the impacts will vary greatly, the location of the brain involved will vary greatly. Disrupting the brain in this random haphazard way can cause a wide variety of symptoms because the brain does so many things. Both those things you're aware of and those things you sort of know the brain does but you don't think about, and those things you never consider, like Everyone knows the brain does thinking and planning and calculation and memory. And people pretty much know the brain does emotions and emotional control and primal instincts. And the brain is responsible for our very conception that we are a discrete entity separate from the atoms of the world that bump up against us and surround us. And this video that's playing in front of our eyes that we think of as consciousness, that's all just a brain perception. And the brain controls your heart rate and your blood pressure and where the blood flows in your body, whether more goes to the muscles or to your brain or to your gut, and whether you're sweating. And so many other things. It doesn't do all of these exclusively. There are other inputs that can affect those, but the brain is deeply involved in all of those things and more. So to get into then what is a concussion, let's look a little bit at brain anatomy. This is just a slice of a brain. You can see in the lower left an inset that shows roughly what slice in the brain it is. It's a slice that does happen to go down into the spinal cord, so you can see a little bit of that. On the periphery, on the outside of the brain, that's the gray matter. It doesn't look gray. It looks like a darker tan on this slice. And inside from that is the white matter. And the white matter has a high content of fat called myelin, and that's what gives it its color. And the cell bodies are more in the periphery, and that's what gives that sort of a grayish color, and that's the gray and the white. A human brain has close to 100 billion neurons. It has 100 trillion synapses, so a typical neuron has 1,000 or more synapses, connections with other neurons. A lot of these neurons are incredibly long. They're small, but they're very long, so they might have a cell body in the very perimeter somewhere like up here, and that might send a projection that goes all the way down and into the spinal cord and down into your mid-back. It wouldn't be past the bottom of your thoracic spine by much, but some of them are extraordinarily large in length. The gyri are these sort of worm-like shapes that are squiggled around there, the noodles of the brain, and the sulci are the spaces in between the noodles, which are like clefts in the brain. And gyrification, or the wrinkling up of the brain, is evolution's way of fitting more cortex and more neuron bodies into our skull. We have to squeeze it in there somehow. And animals with smaller brains or brain to body size ratios don't convolute their brain as much as us. And our skull can only get so big because it has to fit through a birth canal at some point. It does a lot of growing after birth. That's another strategy to get a bigger brain. And this whole brain floats in cerebral spinal fluid, which is a watery fluid. It's pretty much clear. And that suspends, that's why it can be so relatively mushy and still survive gravity and g-forces and acceleration. Let's zoom in just a little bit. This is zooming in on the gray matter of the brain. So this is near the periphery of the brain. This is actually from a mouse gray matter. And these are what are called pyramidal neurons. You can kind of see they have a pyramid shape to them. Pyramids are mostly, well, they look like they're near the bottom. All of these projections coming off of them that you can see are called dendrites. Those are pretty much sensory projections for the nerve. And so those dendrites are reaching out, and other neurons can feed information to them. Each cell has thousands of dendrites. At least this kind of cell is likely to have thousands of dendrites, and generally just one axon. An axon is that very long projection that can send the output from the cell to other cells. This particular kind of neuron is generally excitatory, but different neurons can excite or suppress activity in other neurons. Computer neural networks are sort of based on this. At least they use a similar principle. In this, there's an input layer. This is just graphically how a simple computer neural network might be set up. There's an input layer on the left, that's green, and an output layer on the right, that's the pink circles. The green circles could be inputs that are quantitative, like, I don't know, age, sex, blood pressure, a few other things. And every one of those arrows that goes from the inputs then goes to every one of the first column of hidden layers. And each of the circles in the first column of hidden layers, they can have essentially a sum of all of the inputs coming from the various nodes in the input layer. And then each of the nodes in the second column of hidden layers gets an input from every one in the first column, and so on, right out to the output layer. And then to train the neural network, you have to either up or down regulate all of those arrows, so that some of those arrows are extraneous and they should be pruned. Some of them may actually be negatively correlated with some outcome you're interested in, and they could have a negative value or a positive value. And if you train the neural network right and you set up everything right, then your output layer may have something like something useful, like risk of heart attack in the next decade or whatnot. You can train it to do almost anything. This is an interesting picture that I mostly took because it's pretty. But this is a graphical representation of a computer neural network that was designed to have a morphology similar to all the pyramidal neurons in a mammalian cortex. And by the way, bird cortexes are kind of similar to ours in that regard. So moving in again, zooming in, so now we're not looking at a chunk of cortex. We're looking at a single cartoon of a neuron cell. And the body is on the left, the big purple part. The dendrites are mainly on the left, and they connect to the body, and those are sensory. They get inputs from other neurons. They sort of integrate all of those inputs. And then the axon is the long extension that goes from the body off to the right side of the screen. The myelin sheath, they tend to be little cylinders of myelin that are separate from each other, but those are the insulation around the axon. And then at the axon terminal, the ends of the axon, those would synapse with receptors from other neurons. So a couple things that are important to think about this. One is this is a cartoon of a neuron, and in actuality, the proportions of a neuron in our cortex would be much longer typically. In fact, probably 10,000 times longer than it's represented here. If the axon were the diameter of a piece of spaghetti, the cell body could be here, and the end of the axon terminals could be out on Route 26, and that would be a reasonable proportion. So they're very long and skinny, and that makes them susceptible to tearing from stretch. When they send a signal, so these are electrochemical signals, and basically they're voltage differences between the inside and the outside of the cell. And the cell lives in a soup of ions, charged particles that float around in an aqueous solution. And the number of positively and negatively charged ions is different from on the inside of the cell to the outside. Every ion has its own gradient. And when a cell depolarizes, we use that terminology because it actually loses its voltage potential, it switches it briefly, it can send a wave, a chain reaction, all the way down the axon until it gets to the other end. And cells can do that at a speed of between 10 centimeters a second and over 100 meters per second. So some of them are very fast. But what is causing that voltage wave to go down the axon or to travel in a cell is just a chain reaction of gates opening and closing in the surface of the cell, allowing ions to flow down their concentration gradient, or closing the gates and trying to reestablish the concentration gradient. We're going to zoom in again. This is the synaptic bouton. This is the synapse. The synaptic bouton is that bulge. It's the teardrop-shaped thing on the top. And the presynaptic neuron, this is the very end of its axon. It's one of the probably many ends of the axon, since there can be some branching. And when the signal gets down, the electrochemical signal, the voltage signal gets to the end, it causes these vesicles, these little bubbles, to fuse with the membrane, and the contents of those bubbles, which are molecules of neurotransmitter, are spilled into the synapse. And the synapse is the space between the two cells. And then the postsynaptic neuron, the receiving neuron, is represented at the bottom of the screen, just a part of its membrane. The synapse is super small. It's around 20 nanometers across, typically, so extraordinarily small. The diameter of an axon is 1, maybe 2, or up to a few micrometers but way larger. In fact, this is not in proportion because the width of the axon of the presynaptic neuron should be roughly 1,000 times bigger than the width of the synapse, but it's just a cartoon. And that's kind of what happens. And that's how cells communicate with each other. This postsynaptic neuron is getting input from many presynaptic neurons. And if on balance, added up, there's enough excitatory and not too much inhibitory potential, that postsynaptic neuron may fire and send a signal down its own axon towards other neurons. So concussion neuropathology in just a little bit more detail here, sort of a 1.5 minute version. There's a mechanical insult that causes the brain to jiggle. Tissues are stretched. If you get a bowl of jello jiggling or a cake mold of jello jiggling, parts of it will be stretched. And then neurons are torn, and the cell membranes are actually mechanically torn. That causes changes in neuronal function, malfunction. Ions, the most common, most studied, sodium, potassium, chloride, they cross going down their concentration gradients across the membrane. And when positive or negative ions go from one side or the other side to the other side of the membrane, the voltage across the membrane changes, and that carries a signal. So the neuron may not have depolarized because of input from other neurons. It was simply torn. You tear the neuron, the ions flow through the tear in the neuron, and that triggers a voltage change, which is then propagated to other parts of that neuron. And this causes a lot of neurons in the brain, not a high fraction of them, a very small fraction, but enough of them to cause chaotic, dysregulated signaling. And then even the neurons that were not damaged by the initial mechanical insult are getting haywire signals. And they can exhaust themselves metabolically trying to respond to that. Yeah. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is the most detailed of concussion physiology at the neuropathological level. And then if this is getting a little bit too in the weeds for you, don't worry, because we'll switch to physics. But there's what's happening here, and this is actually a nice slide because it ties everything together. This over on the left is the presynaptic neuron. This is its axon coming in. All of this is a postsynaptic neuron. It's another neuron. The depolarization or the action potential arrives here. These synaptic vesicles dump their neurotransmitter, in this case glutamate, into the synapse, and that stimulates the postsynaptic neuron. That presynaptic neuron may have fired not because it was supposed to, but because something ripped it and caused ions to travel across its cell membrane. So the fact that this action potential is here in the setting of concussion could be a malfunction already. When this cell depolarizes, potassium, when the second cell, when the postsynaptic neuron depolarizes, potassium is released, and if it's getting a lot of these depolarization signals, it will struggle to reset itself, to repolarize, to get the potassium back inside of the cell. How it does that, it has this pump. So if you open a channel and potassium rushes out, you can't expect leaving the channel open for potassium ever to rush back in. That doesn't make sense. But with a energy-dependent pump, you can force the potassium back in and do similarly and reestablish gradients for other ions. But if this is getting a bunch of haywire signals, or if this postsynaptic cell has been torn so that it is leaking, it will never be able to reestablish that gradient. So it will spend a lot of energy trying to bail water out of this boat when the hull is leaking and the water is just coming back in through a tear in the membrane elsewhere. How do we get energy in our cells? Well, sugar. And the currency of energy inside of a cell is adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And so we turn sugar into ATP, and ATP drives that pump. If we don't need a high power input, and if we have plenty of oxygen, we can slowly generate ATP pretty efficiently from sugar, from glucose, with oxidative phosphorylation. And that's what happens if you take a walk for a long time, or you do a nice slow jog. But if you try to sprint up a hill, you'll quickly notice your muscles burning, and that's lactic acid because you're using power faster than you can replenish it aerobically, and your body has to go to its backup channel, which is to try to make ATP out of glucose without oxygen, and a waste product of that channel is lactic acid. And lactic acid makes your muscles feel like they're burning when you exercise hard. Lactic acid can also change the pH in the cells, and in doing so, it can damage mitochondria. It can signal other metabolic cascades that can actually result in the death of the cell. A separate thing that happens is if the membrane of the cell is torn, this is over on the right side, if it's torn along the axon, calcium comes into the cell from outside of the cell. The fluid, the cytoplasm inside of a cell, has a very low concentration of calcium normally. So if the cell is torn, calcium comes in. That calcium tends to damage the molecular skeleton of the axon, and that can cause the transport, the little molecular vehicles that carry molecules along the length of the axon. When they hit the end of the train tracks, because the skeleton there is broken, they just start piling up, and that can cause blebbing and damage to the axon, rupture of the axon. All right, so let's move on to something different. Misperceptions of concussion. Now that we have a basic idea of what concussion is, I like this quote. I put this in chronological order. I think Mark Twain said it first because he lived first, but other people were credited with this as well. For every problem, there's an answer that is simple, neat, and wrong. So I just went to some search engine, a couple of them actually, and looked up what is a concussion, and then I went to the images page, and there were just pages and pages of pictures, kind of like this one. This one is labeled concussion, and it says right at the bottom of the left side, initial impact of concussion, coup, secondary impact, contra coup. This indicates that the brain is sloshing back and forth and slamming into the skull. It is not really what happens, and we're going to get to why that doesn't happen in a minute. But it is the most common misconception, perhaps because it makes intuitive sense, and perhaps because there are so many pictures of it on the internet. This is the coup, contra coup. Sometimes in radiology, you can see a brain that has a bruise on both sides, and the idea is that the brain does get knocked from one side of the skull to the other. At least that's the old hypothesis. Here's another picture from the web. This really doesn't show what happens other than it just calls it a brain contusion. Brain contusions sometimes happen, but it's a different kind of injury. A concussion is not a brain bruise, contusion being bruise. As a matter of fact, it's easy to differentiate them because brain bruises show up very easily on CAT scans and MRIs. Hard to miss them. Whereas concussions are completely invisible on those types of scans. So conflating concussion with another kind of injury is wrong. And then this picture has several different things. It shows a direct impact. There's a baseball hitting this guy's forehead, and it shows blood accumulating in there, putting pressure on the brain. That's a different kind of injury. We would typically call that a severe brain injury. In concussion, we usually call it a mild traumatic brain injury. Blast injuries are different. In some ways, they're similar to concussions, but in blast injuries, like being close to an explosion, which, by the way, I hopefully you're not getting blast injuries in sports. But a blast injury, it's just a shock wave from a supersonic compression wave, and the dynamics are very different at supersonic speeds. And then acceleration, deceleration injury. This says bleeding in front, back, and central brain. So I think the takeaway is a football helmet hits something and the brain bleeds everywhere. And that's not a good message. It's just not helpful. I might give people a pass for these oversimplifications because I think maybe the truth is just a little too complex. I've tried to go through it in the last few minutes, and yeah, it can be a little bit heavy. But it is different than these common explanations. This is a non-concussion injury. This is called an epidural. You see this little, we call it a lenticular shape, a lens shape on the left side. That's bleeding. There's surely a skull fracture, or almost surely a skull fracture on the left side of the image there. A broken artery. It's filling up with blood. This is a similar injury, but larger. This is life-threatening. The problem with swelling up or with taking up space inside of the brain case is there's nowhere for that extra volume to go except to force the brain out of the hole in the bottom of the skull, the hole where the spinal cord comes out, and that's fatal. So this is an extremely severe injury. This is a subdural hematoma. It's another way to bleed inside of the brain. You're just bleeding into a different layer of the lining of the brain. This is a subarachnoid hemorrhage. This is a pretty subtle one. It's right at the arrow, but you can see the blood is going essentially into one of the sulci. All of these are types of bleeds, by the way. Larger subarachnoid hemorrhage, you can see blood is tracking through some of the sulci there. And then this is a bruise on the brain. This is a contusion of the brain, and that's sort of a crush injury to the brain. These are usually pretty high energy mechanisms. And this is a normal brain. There's nothing abnormal about it. And that's what a concussion would look like. The skull, in order to cause bruising in the brain, you either need tremendously high injuries or somehow you need to violate the skull or get the brain to bang into the skull, which is not as easy as it sounds, because the skull is A, a very strong, thick bone, and B, it's a really good shape for absorbing forces. The advantage to this dome shape is that it allows the stress to be turned into a generally just compression stress, and brittle materials can take compression stress really well. And the brain does that. The brain within the skull floats inside of cerebrospinal fluid. So this is the brain, and you can see the light blue is cerebrospinal fluid. It is manufactured deep in the brain. It flows through some channels. It comes out of the brain, and it flows around the brain and gets reabsorbed into the bloodstream. And the brain floats in this fluid, and it's neutrally buoyant. So like anything that's like a jellyfish in the water is all full and looks like a normal three-dimensional shape, and on the land, it really flattens out. The brain, to a lesser extent, does flatten out when it's not floating. So this gives a lot of buoyancy to the brain. During neurosurgery, never mind the numbers, this is just a picture of a brain during surgery. And you can kind of see at the top that there's a gap. Maybe it's not quite a centimeter, but it's way more gap than there normally would be between the brain and the skull, or even between the brain and the dura, which is this membrane that's between the skull and the brain. The reason there's a gap there is when you take the top of the skull off, as happens a lot in neurosurgery, the cerebrospinal fluid can't stay there, it drips out. The brain then is not buoyant, and it sinks down like that jellyfish on the beach. Not quite as much as a jellyfish, but brains shrink, and that's a just well-known, commonly seen phenomenon during brain surgery. Because it's neutrally buoyant, changing the g-forces doesn't really make any difference. If you have a cup of water and you could magically turn up gravity on Earth, the ice cubes wouldn't sink. If you had a cup of water and you swung it around on the end of a string, the ice cubes wouldn't go to the bottom. They float because they're a little less dense than water. And the brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid because it's the same density as cerebrospinal fluid. So increasing g-forces does not cause the brain to slam against the bottom or the front or the back or the side. It's a little counterintuitive, but it's true. But jiggling can still get things jostling inside of the head. So where in a brain does a concussion cause damage? Well, that can be a little tricky. It tends to cause damage in the long axons, the white matter tracts that go a long distance because they're more susceptible to getting torn by these mechanical forces. But also, this is CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is not really the point of my talk today, but CTE is a disease caused by a lot of concussions. And it so happens that CTE causes deposition of a certain kind of protein in the damaged cells, phosphorylated tau protein, and you can stain that protein. And then when there's a section of a brain, this is half of a brain, if it's looking at you, it's like the left half of the brain, you can see where it's darker, the areas where there's more tau deposition. And you can also see this is a zoom in, and this hole right here is a blood vessel that's going through this section. And there's more tau around the blood vessel than there is just spread out in the other tissues. And there's a reason for that. So this is a tree. And I picked this tree because it looks kind of like a brain. It's sort of shaped like that. But also, like a brain, it has these crevices on the outside of, in this case, the canopy, but the canopy is like the cortex. And if this tree is shaking in the wind, where is the most mechanical stress on the branches? It's not way up at the surface, it's where the branches come together. And that's where it has the most mechanical stress. Every branch is like a lever acting on the adjacent branch. And another thing does that too. If you apply stress here, where will the wishbone break? I don't know which side, but it's going to break pretty close to where the two sides of the clavicle come together, because that's where there's the most leverage. And that's why these areas like here and here at the bottom of sulci have a higher deposition of tau. That's also why there's a higher deposition of tau and more damage right around blood vessels. If the brain is kind of like jello, and the blood vessels are stronger than the jello, they're like ropes going through the jello, then when the jello oscillates, it's going to pull on the ropes. That's going to be a mechanism for supporting itself, intended or not intended. And blood vessels are often pretty strong because arterial blood pressure is what it is, and the blood vessels can't pop in the brain. They have to be strong enough to withstand that constant pounding from the heart. And so there's a difference in stiffness between blood vessels and brain tissue that also can cause some stress at those regions. So to make this more intuitive, I did a little experiment in my basement. And this is a glass skull, which I just ordered off Amazon. And it's full of water. And there is a birthday balloon in there, and that is also full of water. And I tried to make the balloon really a neutral buoyancy. If I just filled up the balloon, it would float because the latex or rubber or whatever is a little more buoyant than water. But I put salt water inside the balloon and made it so it's really close to neutral buoyancy. And then I made a setup like this in my basement. There are some strings holding a board which has foam shaped to the shape of the glass so I don't break the glass skull. And I'm going to do a crash test, a concussion test on the skull. And this is what it looks like as we get started. The skull is face into the foam, and it's taped so it'll stay right there. And the balloon is the brain floating in the CSF in this experiment. That's my analogy. And I dropped it a few times. And it hits at a reasonable speed, a pretty good impact there. And let's look at it in slow motion here. Is that going? Yes. In super slow-mo, look at the balloon. The balloon does not slam against the front of the skull. It doesn't even come close to slamming against the front of the skull. As a matter of fact, compared to the skull, the balloon looks almost entirely, I want to go that again, almost entirely imperturbed. It barely moves at all, and to the extent it moves, it's a rotational movement. So I think we can put to rest the idea that the brain sloshes forward when you have a linear deceleration. But you can have a rotational deceleration or acceleration. This is an egg. I actually have to spin it twice to get it going quickly because I have to get the fluid inside the egg going. And then when I stop the egg, it starts going again, the shell does, because the inside of the egg is already spinning at some angular velocity at that point. And I can do the same thing with my glass skull here. Really, the balloon didn't move at all with respect to the glass with a sharp linear deceleration, but with a relatively slow angular acceleration. There's tremendous shear between the balloon and the surface. And that is why rotational accelerations are much more likely to cause concussions than linear accelerations are. Here's that coup contra coup again. Coup contra coup was invented because radiologists saw a pattern where this side of the brain and this side of the brain had bruises at the same time, and someone thought, oh, it must be this happening here. I don't think that's what's actually happening. Maybe sometimes. I think the vast majority of the time, what is actually happening is the skull rotates, and what's that going to do? The skull's going to collide with the brain here and collide with the brain there, and you'll get the bruises in those two sides. So, onto helmet physics. So helmets for football were first regulated in 1973, and within half a decade or so, skull fractures in the NFL were down by 2/3. Fatal head injuries were down by half. And football helmets, including even the early football helmets, are very good at preventing skull fractures, facial fractures, dental injuries, lacerations and bleeding, and often intracranial bleeding as well, because if you don't violate the integrity of the skull, it's pretty hard to make the brain bleed. Not impossible, but for the speeds involved in football, it's pretty close. But it's not clear that helmets prevent concussion. Not for lack of trying. Engineers try to make helmets good for protecting against concussion, but it's really hard to do. This is a lab where they're doing impact testing of a helmet, and there's a dummy, like a crash test dummy. It has all sorts of accelerometers in it, strain gauges, stress gauges inside of the neck of the dummy. Everything is realistic mass. This is modeled after an NFL, size of player, mass of helmet, velocity and momentum of collision. And do helmets help for concussion? Well, not especially, and the reason is if you're not wearing a helmet and you fall and you hit your head on the ground, your head will bounce. And it may injure your scalp, maybe it'll even crack your skull, but if it doesn't crack the skull, as far as your brain is concerned, it just had a rapid velocity change. It went from going downwards to going upwards in a few milliseconds of the collision. If you're wearing a helmet, and this is an egg that I covered in casting material, as far as the egg in there is concerned, it just had a rapid deceleration. That's all that happened. I guarantee the egg isn't broken in here because I used a lot of fiberglass. So it's not clear that helmets help with concussion very much. It does vary by helmet. There are better and worse helmets for this, and the good helmets try to have sort of crumple zones or spring-loaded zones that allow it to absorb some energy. But it's really hard to do. Even if you consider the width of the helmet a crumple zone, you have maybe an inch if you're really good. You don't have a long area to decelerate through. So impact magnitudes, this is sort of from the same study, but there's a lot of ways you can collect data on the impact magnitudes. If you look at g-forces or rotational accelerations, the average concussion in the NFL happens at 50 to 100 Gs. Below 50 Gs, they're a lot less common. And then rotational accelerations of about 500 radians per second squared. So that's just a ballpark of what kinds of accelerations are involved with concussions. You certainly can't predict a concussion based on this. The direction of the impact and a lot of other things make a big difference. And this is gathered with data both from accelerometers in the helmet, and the mouth guard, and the ear canal, video replay and analysis. Hitting a soccer ball is a much lower impact, 10 or 20 Gs. A punch to the head from a very strong boxer could approach 100 Gs. Rotational versus linear accelerations. We talked about how linear accelerations are less likely to cause concussion, so it behooves us to figure out how they happen. If the impacting force is pretty much right at the center of gravity of the head, you'll have, or the center of gravity of the ball, you'll have a linear acceleration. It'll just push that ball away. But if it's off center, you'll have some spin, and that spin causes a rotational acceleration, which is more likely to cause a concussion. Some authors actually say that all concussions are caused by rotational accelerations, and maybe sort of onto something, either because it's unlikely to have a vector of impact that is directly towards a pretty small center of gravity, or because the neck tethers the head to the body, so if you get the head moving in any direction, pretty soon the neck is going to cause it to curve, because the neck has to absorb that energy somehow. Well, let's look at a bat hitting a ball here. This is how I picture the trajectory of the ball. It's coming downhill because the pitching mound is higher and you can only throw so flat of a trajectory. And then there's the trajectory of the bat. And for a level swing, this might not have a lot of spin on the ball, but the motion blurs on the bat to me look like it's chopping down at 45 degrees. So this bat is in a way undercutting the ball, and this ball should head back out to the infield with quite a bit of backspin because the impacting force is not towards the center of the The impacting vector is not towards the center of the ball. And I think every concussion needs a billiard ball analogy, every concussion talk. Ask yourself, will this be a linear acceleration for each of these billiard balls, or will it be a rotational acceleration? Anyone want to volunteer what they think it is? Linear. Clearly this is linear, because the forces are directed really right towards the center. Now we have another setup where the balls are offset from each other. Will this be a linear or rotational or both acceleration?
Both.
Sure looks like it would be both. The force between them is like this, though. Now, is there a friction force? I suppose there's some friction force. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but billiard balls are pretty slippery, and if there's not much friction force, there's not going to be much torque. They're just going to get a sudden linear acceleration pretty much from the center of gravity of one ball towards the center of gravity of the other ball. So I'm oversimplifying, but in a low friction environment, this will be a pretty linear acceleration. And helmet manufacturers know that, which is why the outsides of football helmets are pretty shiny and slick. So if they have glancing blows, they have linear accelerations, and they don't get sudden torques. Now, you've probably seen something like this. Some teams wear them in games. A lot of teams wear them in practices, or you can just buy them. These are helmet covers. And the idea behind this is, let's take that sudden change of direction, take that momentum transfer from one helmet to another, and let's spread it out, not over a few milliseconds. Let's spread it out over more time and more distance by putting padding on the outside of the helmet. And that kind of makes a lot of sense at first. And these caps do tend to decrease peak linear accelerations in helmet testing. And by the way, the state of the art in helmet testing is benchtop testing, like we saw before with dummies, crash test dummies, and pneumatic rams. You can't really do this on players, and no one has really randomized different helmet types to different teams to see which helmet results in less brain injury. However, that change in linear acceleration on the cushion outside of the helmet, it does reduce peak acceleration some. But it also can cause additional friction from the oblique impacts. So the fact that the helmet is larger in radius means that any tangential force will have a larger moment arm to apply a larger torque around the center of rotation, a larger torque to the neck. Another issue with it is if this helmet here, I have just another egg. This guy's not wearing a helmet, but he should be. If this helmet here has a pad on the outside of it, what would have been perhaps a near miss before, as the two players whip past each other and don't quite touch, will become a rotational acceleration with a relatively sticky, high friction surface on the outside. So there will be more impacts. They'll have a larger radius to generate torque and larger friction there as well, larger radius and larger friction. These pads also can defeat more highly engineered helmets. Very highly engineered helmets often have a cantilever effect where the impact pushes the crown of the helmet down and the other parts of the helmet bulge out, and that's how it is essentially a absorbing spring from almost any direction. But if you take that incoming force and put a pad over it, now it doesn't do this cantilever from the point impact of someone else's helmet. Instead, it just has a blunt force and it drives the whole helmet down. So it increases the acceleration to the head. These also add mass to the head. Football helmets are already like 2 kilograms, which is pretty heavy. And then you're adding additional weight on top of that. So are these beneficial? Are they worthwhile? I guess maybe in some situations. It's hard to say overall. I think if you have a really low quality helmet, perhaps, for highly engineered helmets, maybe not. So to look at another sport, what happened here? And this is our physics. Soccer. This is a goalie who was blocking, I think, a penalty shot or something, and blocked it successfully. But it's coming in pretty fast, and 70 miles per hour is a pretty common speed for professional soccer players to kick the ball. Some of them can kick at twice that speed, but this is a women's league, and so I figured 70 is a fair speed to guess. So that's about 30 meters per second. It's just a little over 30 meters per second. If you just look at the picture, a soccer ball is about 9 inches in diameter, so is this compressed by about half of a diameter? I think so. Yeah, 4.5 inches, or 12 centimeters roughly. Is it exactly half? I don't know, but I do know that her face is convex, so her face is making the impact side of the ball concave, so the ball is actually squishing around her quite a bit. So I think it's pretty fair to say it's compressed by about 50% of its diameter. If you know its speed coming in, and you know that when it first touches her nose, it's going 30 meters per second, and then it goes down to 0 meters per second, and then if you assume it bounces back pretty efficiently at about 30 meters per second in the other direction, you can calculate that the duration of the impact is 14 milliseconds. About 7 milliseconds of the ball coming in, and 7 milliseconds of the ball going away. You can also figure out, based on the average mass of a human head, which is around 5 kilograms, which is around 11 times the mass of a soccer ball. By conservation of momentum, you can figure out how fast the head ends up going. And it ends up going about 10% of the delta velocity of the ball. The ball came in at 30, went out at 30, and so that's 60 meters per second, and then the head ends up going 6 meters per second. I don't know why. I think rounding, I wanted to keep it at 1 sig fig. That's why it doesn't say, that's why it just says 6 instead of 1/11. You can also figure out that the head travels 2 centimeters during this impact. Now the ball traveled 24-ish centimeters because half the diameter of the ball coming in and then half the diameter of the ball going out. But in all of that time, the head moves about 2 centimeters backwards. So by the time the ball is off camera again, her head has really not moved that very far, and it's moving very slow compared to the ball. We can calculate, because acceleration equals velocity divided by time, we can find the average acceleration of her head during this collision. The time is 14 milliseconds. Her head, I'm just saying, started at around 0 meters per second, at least in the plane of the ball. And so the acceleration comes out to about 44 Gs, which is a lot of Gs, but is less than typically causes a concussion in NFL hits. So does she have a concussion? I don't know. Some concussive blow, like the same pathology of a concussion, but at a slightly lower level, that doesn't clinically make the person look delirious and have a headache and be dizzy, but is probably rattling some things and making the person, the player, a little bit injured. I'm pretty sure this would have caused a subconcussive blow. You can't do that every day and have a good brain in the long run. Or a good nose. Yeah, exactly. So F equals ma, we can figure out roughly what the force on her face is because we know the acceleration of her head and the mass of her head, and it comes out to around 480 pounds. Now this is an average acceleration over those 14 milliseconds. The normal force between the ball and the face is higher right here where the ball is at peak compression, and lower when the ball is only a little compressed. So peak normal force is probably well over 500 pounds. It's amazing that it doesn't really break her nose, but this force is spread out over a large part of the face, and the force is only on her face for a very small amount of time, and that makes a difference. Less energy is delivered. So what happens right after this? Initially, I chose this picture also because it looks like the ball is pretty much straight at the center of mass of the head, where I would picture the center of mass to be of the head somewhere in this area, but right between the ears. So what happens? I think over the next split second, the center of mass of her head goes backwards, maybe the neck extends by up to 90 degrees from where it was before the collision. And I just eyeballed, and I think this is about a 20 centimeter arc. The center of mass of the head came down about 20 centimeters. If you assume that she goes from 6 meters per second in her head to 0 meters per second in a certain amount of time, then the deceleration time is 70 milliseconds. You can back that out if you know how far it has before it has to get down to 0 meters per second. The linear acceleration is 9 Gs. Now 9 Gs is kind of, it seems like a lot. It's more than fighter pilots really like to try to put up with, but compared to concussion, now we're like almost an order of magnitude below the accelerations that are associated with concussions, at least from football data. And the rotational acceleration, same calculation, but going back about 90 degrees. That is 600 radians per second, and that is an order of magnitude below the typical rotational accelerations for a concussion in football. So what this tells me is when the ball is hitting her head, she's at close to concussive accelerations. And when her head is decelerating under the influence of her neck, she is an order of magnitude below concussive magnitude accelerations. So I don't think that the hypothesis that every even linear acceleration of the head causes a rotational component which causes a concussion makes sense. The neck is simply not strong enough to impart that much force. Now this guy got hit, I think, probably on the right side of his face a few milliseconds ago. His head looks like it's, 45 to 60 degrees turned to the left. I presume that that's the ball's influence, and so he had a rapid rotation. I didn't do the math on this one, you'll be glad to hear, but I think he's at a much higher risk for concussion because this was not a linear impact. There's a very obvious rotational component to this acceleration. This is, I think, probably something we should get away from saying, although it doesn't really matter, that a concussion can be caused by a hit to the body. This is a fairly straight hit to the body. There's no head contact, and I think when 43 has not yet touched 13's head at all in this play. So the question is 13 possibly going to get a concussion from a hard hit like this? And I suspect not. If we look here, we want to figure out the accelerations. The neck would have to convey this force somehow to 13's head. Force equals ma. A typical head is 5 kilograms. He's an NFLer. His head might be bigger, but let's call it 5. Plus 2 kilograms of helmet is 7 kilograms. 100 Gs is commonly given as a typical acceleration for a concussion in the NFL. And so we have 700 kilogram force, which I know is not an SI unit, but it comes out to about 1,500 pounds that his neck would have to be able to exert on his head to impart enough acceleration to give him a concussion. So I don't think his neck is strong enough. I don't think it's such a bad myth, however, because if it makes people more inclined to be cautious and if in doubt, report a concussion, fine. Let the person get checked out. The other thing is, I don't know what happens. Does his head continue to travel and bounce off of 43's back or 43's elbow? And does 25 clobber him a split second later? And does he get laid out on the ground and hit his head hard on the turf? I mean, all those things could happen. And when you're watching a game, you can't see that stuff happening. So should he be checked for a concussion? Sure, if there are any signs that he seems concussed. But his neck can't generate those kinds of forces. The neck is just along for the ride. I think the only way the neck could generate that kind of force is an axial load if all the muscles were pulling in the same direction. But unless, that's not a loading scenario you see in sports. So concussive brain injury, we had a nice little jaunt through the physics and physiology of concussion. I think it's fun to think about these things, but concussion is also, it's a pretty serious topic. People's lives are affected by concussion. Repeated exposure, we have pretty good evidence, is very detrimental to the brain. We've learned a lot about concussion over the last 2 decades since it really started to be recognized as an injury we should pay attention to. We've also learned quite a bit about the way the brain works and what it does over those past 2 decades, but we have a lot more to learn. It feels like we're just scratching the surface on figuring out how bad are concussions and how many can we have and how long do they affect you. And some of the research we're doing with a couple other people I see in the room involves how much people's gait and their ability to drive a car is affected by concussion. So we're really just trying to figure out the beginnings. But we've improved a lot with our ability to recognize, getting out information to people. They should report concussions if they're suspected. Our treatment protocols are certainly better than they were 10 or even 5 years ago. So we're moving in the right direction, but concussion is not a solved thing. We don't have a cure for concussion. We haven't mitigated the damage to individuals or to society from concussion, economically or academically or psychosocially. So there's a lot more to do, and I don't think that the cure, the solution to concussion is really going to come from scientists and physicians on expert panels updating guidelines and making medicines. This is really going to be something that society has to grapple with. Like, people have to decide what risks they want to take, what sports they want to play, how long they want to subject themselves to certain kinds of stresses on the brain. And if you just think of the brain as a black box or a pink blob that has a gelatinous constitution, or people don't even realize it. It's a pink blob between your ears, and it does magical stuff. If you think about your brain at all, then you run the risk of being overly naive and not even being able to partake in the societal conversation of what's the impact of concussion and what should our role be in concussion. But if you know you have 100 billion neurons, 200 to 300 billion cells in your brain, 100 trillion synapses. Some of these cells are hundreds of thousands of times longer than they are wide. And all of that is working to do everything from making you conscious and everything else your body does, then it might give you pause to subject yourself to any of these mechanisms on the screen right here. So next time someone brings up the topic of concussion, tell them actually what a concussion is. Thank you.
Okay. So Q&A time. So we have at least one question here in the room.
All the pictures that you show are of athletes that are in the prime of their life, you know, muscles and everything. And half the time they know that, you know, they're going to get hit. But for the average person, okay, that's not in shape, like most of us probably. Okay, we got hit the same way. Will our bodies react a little differently being out of shape as opposed to those that are in shape?
Yeah, that's a good question. The study where they had a crash test dummy and a pneumatic impactor hitting that either with another helmet or just a mass hitting the helmet there, they were calibrating that to replicate typical NFL hits. And their crash test dummy, which came from some automotive source, kept saying this is a fatal cervical fracture, or is in the red zone where that is not a negligible probability. So they really had to recalibrate their machinery to take into account for the fact that fairly common NFL collisions could kill normal people in, say, automotive crash test scenarios. So yes, that's different. As far as resilience to concussions, we don't really know whether the people who get to the NFL have somehow tough heads that are pretty resilient to concussions, or whether they've sustained a lot of damage but are still functional, or both. if there's a survivor's bias that, only a certain type of person can play long enough, that's an open question, but the research is very easy to do, comparatively speaking, on athletes because they put themselves in exposures like boxing where they're expected to get hit in the head many times over the next 12 minutes or whatever. And normal people, you just can't ethically do that. So a lot of our data that we have for the general population is extrapolation from sports concussion. One reason that sports concussion is kind of a hot topic is it's just a realm where we see a lot of concussions. And, sadly, one of the leading causes of mild traumatic brain injury in children in the United States is a school sport. One of several school sports, but there's an obvious one. Like, we don't box anymore. So a good question. But for practicality reasons, we frequently have to look. The thing is, if you see people get concussed in the boxing ring or on the soccer pitch or on the gridiron, you can replay it. You can instrument them beforehand. If you just get people who had car crashes, you don't have video of what's going on in slow motion. And people may have to drive their whole life to get that one car crash or 0 car crashes if they're lucky. So it's just way easier to study.
So speaking of car crashes, since the advent of airbags, has there been a measurable drop in concussions due to car crashes?
I'm not aware of data on that specifically, but when I was in residency and I was on trauma surgery, one of the trauma surgeons said back in the day when he trained, you could kill yourself by driving off a cliff, and now you just wake up in the ER with a broken ankle, or a concussion. But cars are incomparably safer than they used to be with not just airbags in every direction. The doors airbags, the side curtain airbags, the steering wheel. Every passenger in the vehicle has their own couple of airbags. So it certainly has helped a lot. I think the emphasis there is often on preventing fatal injuries. And if you walk away from a car crash that deploys your airbags with only, quote unquote, only a concussion, you've done fairly well. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions here? Oh, we got one here. So just
Is concussion linked to chronic traumatic encephalopathy in football players and boxers over time?
Yes, it is. Let's see. So that's an interesting question because some people will say it's contentious, and there are groups of scientists, and some scientists have their own ulterior motives, but there are groups of scientists that almost have a back and forth conversation or yelling match through the literature where they try to answer each other's research studies. There was a really famous study. It was picked up in the lay media, I think 2017, out of the Boston Brain Consortium, the Brain Bank, Binghamton University. And the lead neuropathologist there, Ann McKee, had a series of 100 brains from 111 brains of retired NFL athletes, as well as a bunch of brains from collegiate football players and 17 brains from high school football players. And she did the pathological analysis to look for the protein deposition that is the hallmark of CTE, and found 110 out of 111 of the NFL players' brains had CTE. And I think it was 17%, a lowish percent of the high school football players. And a common criticism of that study was, well, that's a convenience sample, and we don't know what the actual incidence is because you just have the numerator, not the denominator. And not only do you have just the numerator, you have the numerator of NFL veterans who for some reason had their brains donated. So maybe they had early dementia, or they died at an early age, or they committed suicide and left a note saying, check my brain, for whatever reason. So that's a legitimate criticism of the study, I suppose, to a point. It certainly means that you can't look at the high school players and say 17% of high school kids who play football have CTE. That would be a mistake because there are several million youth football players, and they had a dozen or a couple dozen of them in their study, and there was a massive selection bias. Somebody who died in high school, and then their family decided they needed to send their brain for autopsy at a specialty center. That kid was very unusual in some ways. But it's not the case with the NFL teams, because if they had 111 NFL brains in their study and 110 of them had CTE, you can only make the denominator so big. You can make the denominator all NFL veterans who died in the years that they were allowing submissions to this study, which was, 7 years or something. I think the denominator ends up being 11 or 1,200. And so if the numerator is 110 and the denominator is 1,100, it's like 10% when you divide it out. So in the absolute rosiest scenario where everybody with CTE had their brain sent for this study and nobody whose brain wasn't donated has CTE, you still get an incidence of 10%, which is shockingly high. So based on that study, I think it is pretty common from repeated concussions. There are other studies that look at, there was a Mayo Clinic one in 2015 where they just have lots of interesting brains, not just people who had concussion, people who had Parkinson's disease, people who had Lewy body dementia, people who had seizures, people who had, as far as we know, totally normal brains, and they just had a really large data bank, and they said, what fraction of these people would have CTE if we were to do an analysis? And it was well under 1%. So it's not endemic in the general population, but it does appear to be endemic in at least the highest level of football. And by the way, that same study had collegiate athletes, and I forget the percentage, but it was a pretty high percent. It was like 90% that had some markers of CTE. So it's concerning, but I think for the average person, your exposure is nowhere close to what a professional athlete in a collision sport is. Might give you some qualms about patronizing the sport, but that's up to you. You're safe.
I think we have a couple of questions out of the chat.
String of questions from Andrew here. Why don't we worry about concussions in older folks as much as younger folks? Does age-related brain atrophy affect concussion?
Yeah, I mean, I can say it can make the recovery potentially harder. It can also confound things. If somebody is in their 70s and they don't do well on some of the cognitive tests that we give them, you don't generally know their baseline, so that makes it hard. You may treat them the same way and get them as high functioning as you can. A lot of the other tests that we do are things like eyes closed, single leg balance, repeating strings of numbers backwards, or doing mental arithmetic. Some people are good at that and some people are not. When you get to older people, there's another class of injuries that start to be concerning. One is bleeds. They may be on antiplatelet therapies for heart issues, or on NSAIDs, which can thin blood, or anticoagulants like warfarin, and there's a whole bunch of other ones that can make bleeding a lot more likely, so a smaller trauma. Brain atrophy makes the brain smaller within the skull, so it's not as snug of a fit, which may not be a concern for a straight linear acceleration, but most accelerations have a rotational component, and we described the veins that go from the brain to the skull as bridging veins, and if the brain twists in the skull, those bridging veins are more likely to be torn than if the brain is snugly within the skull without much extra room, which arrests its rotation a little bit faster. I think in general, we get our research from sports, but we just try to do our best to treat every patient we see.
Another one from Andrew. We seem to worry about ICH more with the older population. Is it just because those are more life-threatening?
Yeah, so ICHs, there are some ICHs, intracranial hemorrhages, that is, that if they take up a lot of space inside of the brain, if you just keep on bleeding out of your arm, as long as you don't lose so much blood that you become hypotensive, it's not that big of a deal. But if you bleed into the brain, even 50 or 100 milliliters can create enough compression of your brain that it can start to extrude some brain contents out of the skull, and that can be fatal. So those bleeds, especially if people, for whatever reason, don't coagulate well, can be problematic. And yeah, so that's a little bit higher risk in older people due to the smaller brains and the higher risk of poor coagulation. Yeah. When people go to the, I think it's important to think about the mechanism. If you have a young person who surely doesn't have brain atrophy and they were wearing a helmet and the helmet didn't come off and they got knocked down on a play and they're dizzy and confused, it's pretty surely a concussion. If their helmet didn't come off, it's pretty exceptionally rare that they would be bleeding in their brain. So going to the emergency department, I think that in general CAT scans are overdone. I know that no one wants to miss a brain bleed, but there's a lot of radiation from a CAT scan. It's like half a year of just background radiation on the surface of Earth. So you'd rather not give all that radiation, especially to little kids, because if you scramble their DNA a little bit, they have 7, 8 decades for those little changes to propagate into, detrimental problems like cancer down the line. And there are some indications from some types of studies that the amount of radiation, ionizing radiation from CT scans does do some harm. And so it's tough because that harm is decades in the future, but I think there's also a real benefit to using some clinical judgment and looking at the context of the injury and being at least pretty thoughtful and cautious about the use of CT scans. For instance, if you don't need to know if they have a brain bleed right now tonight, a CT scan can give you that information in a few minutes. Get an MRI. An MRI takes 20 minutes. You might have to schedule it and go across the street to get it or something. If you can get it done tomorrow, just get an MRI. There's no radiation. You get the same information. But that's not standard practice. In the emergency department, it's make sure they're not dying right now, and no one's going to sue me ever for this, and then send them out the door. And a CT scan is the way to do that. But it's probably not optimal medicine. I certainly understand why it's done, but it's tough. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do what? Oh, the MRI? I don't know. If you're an emergency department physician, everything is stat, and it all is done before insurance gets to look at any records. So, yeah. If you made a case for it, you could probably get it, but it certainly is more work. Yeah.
Somewhat related to that commentary, Andrew asks if diagnostic imaging can't diagnose a concussion, is there any reason to go to an emergency department or walk-in if a concussion-causing injury occurs, and would it be just to rule out a more extensive injury?
Yeah, well, the main reason would be to rule out a more extensive injury or the rare injury that requires hospitalization or neurosurgery. However, if in doubt, it's probably worthwhile seeing a provider who has some experience in concussions. Sometimes I think walk-ins do that pretty well. They're often staffed by family medicine type of people who aren't interested in just running the CT scanner all night. And if they're not that worried, then you can follow up with primary care or with a concussion center like ours a day or two later, and that's perfectly adequate. You're right. I do a lot of sideline coverage, as do a lot of people in UHS sports medicine. If I don't want the person to get a CT scan, if I don't think a CT scan is what they need tonight, I don't send them to the emergency department, because I know if I send them to the emergency department, they're going to get a CT scan. If they have it, yeah. So, but I sort of am a specialist in concussion, so I'm often comfortable saying, based on your mechanism and what I saw and how you are now, and these are a couple of reasons you might want to go to the emergency department later, but save for those reasons, you simply don't have to go. But that comes with experience, and so some people are, not something they're comfortable with.
What kind of treatment are there for?
Yeah, so treatment has evolved a lot. The main thing, the mantra is, first of all, remove from sports. If in doubt, take them out, because the worst thing you can really do is get another hit to the head when you've already sustained some of these injuries and you have that metabolic cascade of excessive glucose use and waste product production, you can get osmotic shifts. And if you stack another concussion on top of that, it can make things exponentially worse, and rarely, but occasionally even life-threateningly worse. So the first thing is, if in doubt, just sit them out. The second thing is get follow-up with someone who treats concussions for an evaluation of if it is a concussion and what needs to be done. And then the general simplest management is a little bit of rest until you're more or less asymptomatic or at baseline, and then a gradual return to activity, usually with specified stages and intensities and activities. And if you get through, if you get through light cardio and you feel fine, you could do a little bit of agility drills, and if you feel fine with that, you can do some weightlifting. If you feel fine with that, you can do a full non-contact practice. If you feel fine with that, you can do a full practice, spaced out, minimum 24 hours per stage, so it takes 5 or 6 days at best, at shortest. So that's the simplest little protocol, and for uncomplicated concussions that recover well, that works. And if people have protracted symptoms, it can go a lot of different ways. Often there are some research-backed physical therapy modalities that can help. A lot of these are based at helping people get back to school, stay in school, not fall behind, avoid the biopsychosocial ramifications like isolation from being at home, stress because you're behind in your schoolwork, social isolation and depression because you haven't seen your kids or your friends because you're sequestered at home, loss of identity because you used to be like you identified as an athlete and now you're not allowed to play. There's a lot of things you can work on. And then it's a sort of separate issue of what do you do with prolonged post-concussion syndrome. So if they're not getting better after a few weeks, you can start to tailor the treatments. But in short, no medicine really cures concussions or accelerates the resolution of concussion. They're pretty much all symptomatic, and it's to help people function while their brain is recovering. Which brings me to really the best way to treat a concussion is not to get a concussion, because most of our treatments are helping you feel okay while your brain gradually heals by itself.
All right, last question from the chat, and again, the flow of conversation here is feeding right into these. Maureen asks, can you talk a little bit about the brain's ability to heal after injury?
Yeah. Most concussions, infrequent concussions, isolated concussions that aren't tremendously bad or aren't in short succession one after the other, recover really well, essentially 100%. Sometimes it seems like a dogma to say concussions recover 100% because, if you get 3 concussions playing your sport, certainly 4, I think most providers will have that conversation about maybe you shouldn't play that sport, maybe the risks and the benefits don't pan out correctly. But all concussions aren't the same. Some of them you have a headache for a few hours or a couple days and that's it, and some of them cause depression and repeating a year in school, and that's of course a totally different order of magnitude. So with, let's see, what was the original question? Because I think I went tangential.
But the brain's ability to heal.
So it has a pretty good ability to heal. It's hard to get through life and never hit your head. So concussions do heal quite well in general, as long as you don't have too many of them and you don't have too bad of them. The caveat I would say is, if you get 3 run-of-the-mill concussions, we start to talk about maybe you shouldn't play that sport anymore. Well, after the first run-of-the-mill concussion or the second one, something was happening, so your brain was keeping score, so the third one starts to get worse. We know that if you keep on getting them, the recovery gets longer and slower, and so there's obviously something in your brain that is ratcheting the damage and keeping track of that, or else we wouldn't be worried about getting a concussion once a year. So that dogma doesn't really doesn't hold up to what I would say Socratic scrutiny. But infrequent concussions, yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that.
All right, I think we've sort of exhausted our chat questions, and you got a question? All right, one more question. And then we understand that skies are clearing up a little bit, so we're going to try to get our 6-inch refracting telescope on Jupiter. So the rule is you can't leave here until you look through your scope. All right? But here's your last question.
Is there a way to completely prevent a concussion entirely? Like make it so there's no chance that you could get it at all?
I can answer that. We're going to wrap you in bubble wrap
Yeah.
and just keep you in that chair. Or,
No, probably the best is, it's not, maybe not bubble wrap exactly, but give a lot of consideration to the activities you partake in, because a lot of concussions in retrospect, some are just, I slipped on ice, it was black ice, I didn't know it was there, I thought it was dry pavement. What are you going to do? That can happen. But a lot of them are preceded by, I was trying to do this stunt, or you were playing a sport that's high risk for it. So we can certainly reduce the number of concussions by anticipating where things might go wrong.
all right, well, Dr. Hunter, thank you again very much for this presentation. It was really very detailed, went into a lot of the math, and I actually remembered some of that math. But anyway, I do appreciate you coming up and sharing what is clearly your passion. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. Next week, our program is actually a meteorologist from the National Weather Service here in Binghamton is going to talk about weather forecasting, specifically winter weather forecasting, and even more specifically, how this season's El Nino is expected to affect us. So we'll welcome you back here, either in person or watching on our live stream. So again, I want to thank you for this evening's program, and thank you all for coming. And see you next week.